So this last weekend was Labor Day weekend, and Lauren and I took a day trip to Tucson to see some museums, enjoy some food, do, I don't know, non-Phoenix related stuff. And part of that was going to the Arizona Desert Sonora Museum, which is this lovely sprawling arboretum and museum in Saguaro National Park. And I learned a fun fact there, Naomi, which just absolutely blew my mind. Arizona has incredible diversity of wildlife. But 75% of all the diversity of animal wildlife in Arizona is found in riparian corridors, which only encompass 0.5% of the total land area of Arizona. So, Arizona, this dusty old state that no one ever really thinks of, actually has like this incredible assortment of, trees and plants and flowers and insects and tiny mammals and whatnot, but it's only found in places the vast majority of the Arizona public will never go. And this isn't particularly funny or anything. This doesn't wrap up in a funny anecdote, but I just thought it was really cool. And I hope our audience has grown to respect the knowledge that we every week come up with to improve their lives and make them smarter. Please forgive us, audience.
I would like to say that every so often I, miss Phoenix. I miss living there since moving to San Diego. But then I like look out my window every so often. It's like nighttime. I'm closing my window for the day. And I look down and there's coyotes running through my neighborhood. And I'm like, oh, a little piece of home. And I'm okay.
Naomi's like, I wish there was 0% diversity in Phoenix. I don't want any wild creatures outside my house. I want a saguaro, and that's it. That's all I need.
Yeah, the saguaro is the diversity.
Wow, we're just kicking ass and taking names. This is what happens when we take a 2 week break from podcasting, Naomi. Imagine how
Yeah,
awkward
yeah.
we take like a 2 year break and then try to come back.
Ugh. Ugh. No, no, no.
It'll be the same quality as the Joe Rogan show is now. And welcome back to Why Won't No One Date These Guys, a podcast that's soon to be canceled for talking smack about the Joe Rogan show, a show that has millions of times more downloads than we will ever have in the heat death lifespan of the universe. I'm Joel Guy.
And I'm Naomi Guy. I am co-yapper of this podcast. And
Yapper.
welcome to all things Why We Don't Date These Guys. Sex, dating, relationships, the media surrounding it. Currently, we're talking about a book called Intimate Matters. Joel, take it away.
I am Joel Guy, and I'm excited to return to Intimate Matters today, but I do have a drink to try. It is the Something and Nothing brand cucumber premium soda, made with the highest quality juices, extracts, and botanicals. I saw this at a market the other day when I was in Tucson, and it looked refreshing, and I am excited to now taste it and learn that actually I hate cucumber soda.
Why did you say botanicals like that, bro?
I feel hurt. It tastes like just straight cucumber juice. Like someone just like squeezed out a cucumber, like a dish towel, into a can. I'm not getting a lot of
Ew.
carbonation. I don't know, like cucumber water is like fine, but
Yeah.
I don't really get the botanicals. It says they have grape and lemon juice in here, but yeah, this is not what I consider to be cucumber soda. I expect a little bit of sweetness and some carbonation in soda. It's not refreshing, but for what I paid for it, I would expect a little bit more than what I could produce by buying a cucumber at a lower price, mind you, at a grocery store, juicing it, and then drinking what came out. I don't hate it, but like it's not what I was expecting, and it's not what I would consider soda. So such is life. Naomi, we are back to hopefully wrap up Intimate Matters, Part 3, a history of sexuality in America. We've discussed in the first two parts a lot of the kind of pre revolutionary and then Civil War era of America and how different historical, economic, and social changes influenced our perception of relationships and sexuality. And this week we are back to actually skim through most of the 19th and 20th century. As I mentioned in the last part of part two, um, it's not that there's not a lot of interesting information in here. I would strongly encourage anyone listening to this to pick up a copy because I'm glossing over literally decades of history. It's more of like a lot of this we've already covered in some form or another on other episodes. So I'm kind of just picking out the anecdotes that I thought were interesting, that were different enough from what we've discussed before, that I think illuminate certain aspects of American history that like otherwise we would not normally talk about. If there's things that you want to learn more about, more than happy to expand upon it. But there are just a couple of areas I'm going to bounce around again between the 19th and 20th centuries to wrap up this discussion of the book. Any questions, comments, concerns before we dive back in, Naomi?
Go for it. Hit it. Do it.
Excellent. So, despite universal disapproval of same sex relationships, several kinds of same sex relationships, some of them sexual, flourished in the 19th century. The unique social worlds inhabited by middle class men and women encouraged intimate relationships, especially between women who were socialized to view themselves as more spiritual than men and to value the separate female sphere. For both women and men, a cult of friendship fostered romantic feelings and may have sheltered sexual practices. Outside of this largely middle class arena of romantic friendship, a variety of same sex relationships formed where men and women lived in isolation from the opposite sex in mining or cowboy towns, for example, or in female academies. Within these settings, romantic friendships coexisted with sexual relationships, overlapping at times. Although they differed in formal structure from courtship and marriage, intimate relationships between members of the same sex often mirrored the underlying themes in 19th century family life. In them, women and men express passionate longing for emotional, spiritual, and physical intimacy without the traditional association of sexuality and reproduction. The overlap of the romantic, erotic, and physical has made it difficult to define these relationships, especially in light of the ways sexual meanings have changed in the 20th century. The modern terms homosexuality and heterosexuality do not apply to an era that had not yet articulated these distinctions. Only in the late 19th century did European and American medical writers apply these categories and stigmatize some same sex relationships as a form of sexual perversion. Until the 1880s, most romantic friendships were thought to be devoid of sexual content. Thus, a woman or man could write of affectionate desire for a loved one of the same gender without causing an eyebrow to be raised. Just as contemporary observers assume these relationships to be asexual, so have many historians. Given the stigma attached to same sex love in the 20th century, some writers have taken great pains to deny even the possibility of homosexual contact in 19th century friendships. The descendants and biographers of well known figures such as Emily Dickinson or Walt Whitman insist that the terms of loving endearment expressed by those writers for their same sex friends by no means implied sexual longing. The dearth of direct evidence above all sexual relations compounds the problems of definition. Even though letters and diaries only rarely mention genital contact, the birth of children provides a confirmation of heterosexual intercourse. The absence of procreative evidence and the fact that few people left direct records of homosexual acts could mean either the acts did not occur or simply that they were not recorded. The condemnation of the practice at the end of the century provides a clue that it indeed existed. At the same time, however, this century may have silenced the mention of same sex intimacy within sources of the past. So I think this is like a really important framing for understanding kind of the difficulty of analyzing queer relationships in prior centuries. The terminology wasn't there. Many people were kind of forced into heterosexual relationships, whether they wanted them or not. There was a lot of language used between people who either had no sexual interest in one another or it's kind of ambiguous, so we really can't tell what their intention was. And I think often you'll find, even in the modern era, there are lots of environments where people are put together in same sex spaces and have sex with people of the same sex, but later leave those spaces and continue in heterosexual relationships. A good example would be prisons. There's a lot of queer behavior that occurs in both male and female prisons. They're a good example. It's very possible there are people in there who identify as bisexual or gay, but the vast majority of them are without heterosexual contact for vast periods of time and resort to other means in order to get sexual pleasure. And so the same applies kind of to the past, where it's like, this is kind of a grab bag unless we have like photographic proof, unless we have like diaries between people discussing like what they did. It's very difficult to say things for certain. And like the book goes into detail, we still have evidence, but you really shouldn't forget that like one of the big problems of understanding queer history is that so much of queer documentation has been destroyed over time. So parents who were disapproving found, diaries between people, burned them, right? Repertoire, repositories of knowledge, like in Germany prior to the 1930s, were destroyed as part of, the Nazis' rise to power. Lots of chronicles from the ancient past about queer individuals and like eroticism in general were destroyed throughout the Middle Ages through a variety of different people taking over, medieval towns and, destroying things that they didn't agree with of, past practices and whatnot. So this book, was written in the 1980s, and they're almost at the cutting edge of this conversation because they recognize from the get that having this conversation is very difficult in an honest and accurate way, just because the practice of chronicling queer history has been a very fragmented and illusory concept up until the present.
I don't really have much to say. I feel like you've covered all of it. I think that this is a great understanding of queer history, and we just read that book, the last book that we read. Remind me of that name.
Straight state.
Straight State. There we go. So I think that these really mesh well together, those two books. And so the cracks in the storyline in Intimate Matters are kind of filled in with the Straight State and vice versa. So
Yeah. I should note for listeners, we are editing out a lot of my coughs and wheezes. If you hear me pronounce things in a weird way, slow my pace, or otherwise change my intonation, it is probably because I'm trying to avoid hacking and wheezing, so I don't have to record the same lines multiple times in a row. However difficult it may be to know whether sexual, that is, genital, relations characterize particular same sex friendships, it is clear that the meaning of same sex love gradually changed over the course of the 19th century. Colonial Americans had no concept of homosexuality as a personal condition or identity. We've discussed this in the prior two parts. Rather, individual acts of sodomy, or buggery, were considered sins to be punished and for which a man could repent. The laws almost always applied to men, not women, because they typically referred to the unnatural spilling of seed, the biblical sin of onan. 19th century Americans continued to condemn sodomy, a term which they used not only to anal sex between men, but also to various non procreative sexual acts, including masturbation and oral sex. Over the course of the century, new meanings were attached to these terms. At first, the language of religion remained prominent in discussions of sodomy. For example, an 1810 Maryland court indictment for sodomy stated the defendant had been moved and seduced by the instigation of the devil. But gradually, legal concerns replaced religious ones. After the American Revolution, the phrase crimes against nature increasingly appeared in statutes, implying that acts of sodomy offended a natural order rather than the will of God. By the end of the century, physicians employed a medical language referring to sodomy not as a sin or spiritual failing, but rather as a disease and a manifestation of a bodily or mental condition. During the 1880s, the labels congenital inversion and perversion were applied not only to male sexual acts, but to sexual or romantic unions between women, as well as those between men. Underlining these redefinitions were growing possibilities for sexual relations between members of the same gender. Within the working class, men and women who lived outside of traditional families formed same sex partnerships for economic or sexual reasons, or for both. Within the middle class, romantic friendships fostered both spiritual and physical intimacy that might become sexual. For men, more than for women, same sex relationships often crossed class boundaries. For both sexes, these relationships formed unself consciously. Not until the last quarter of the century did those who engaged in same sex relationships find it necessary to hide or deny their passionate attachments. The first model of same sex relationship, that of sexual or romantic partnerships outside the familial model, was most readily available to white wage earning men. For them, the industrializing economy offered opportunities to explore sexuality outside of marriage, whether on city streets or in the separate sphere of all male activity. The ability to purchase goods and services allowed men to live beyond familial controls, while the city provided anonymity, not, boy, that word's just escaping me today. Anonymity.
anonymity.
Thank you, Naomi. We'll defer to that for their actions. Wage earning men who lived in urban boarding houses could bring other men to their rooms for the night or longer. In 1846, two New York men who had met in church lived together for 3 months, engaging in nightly carnal intercourse. During the 1860s, poet Walt Whitman frequently brought home young working class men whom he met in New York, Brooklyn, and Washington, D.C. City of orgies, walks, and joys, he called Manhattan. The city's frequent and with swift flash of eyes offering me love repaid the poet's efforts. So then it provides some notes about the various men that he was sleeping with and the documentation that he provided. He was like, oh yeah, September 3rd, I did it with Mike. October 11th, did it with David Wilson. October 9th, Jerry Taylor. The historians appreciate your dedication to keeping track of your sex life, Walt Whitman. It really makes things easier. Another writer also benefited from urban.
Anonymity.
Thank you. In 1866, Horatio Algier was run out of his pulpit in a small Massachusetts town for the revolting crime of unnatural familiarity with boys. Algier moved to New York City, where he could avoid censure for his pederastic interest in the young men of the streets, about whom he wrote in his popular novels. At a time when the state was not heavily involved in the regulation of morality, urban police did not vigorously prosecute consensual sodomy. Between 1796 and 1873, for example, New York City courts issued only 22 indictments for sodomy, and those usually involved the use of force or disparity in the men's ages. Thus, in 1857, George Mason was arrested for committing sodomy with boys aged 11 to 14. Not until the end of the century did New York law criminalize consenting to sodomy. By then, Americans had been alerted to the phenomenon of homosexuality, for as the opportunities for same sex relationships grew, the first signs of a visible urban homosexual subculture appeared, along with the strong condemnation of homosexuality by medical writers. A couple of other things. In addition to the cities, wherever young single men congregated as soldiers, prisoners, or cowboys, the possibility for same sex relationships increased. During the Civil War, for example, when Walt Whitman served as a nurse, he formed deep attachments to the young Union and rebel soldiers he tended. I believe no men ever loved each other as I and some of these poor, wounded, sick, and dying men love each other, he wrote. Before he left at night, he kissed the poor boys. Of a 19-year-old Southern captain, he declared our affection as quite an affair, quite romantic. Sometimes when I lean over to say I'm going, he puts his arm around my neck, draws my face down, etc. Similarly, a Confederate general developed a strong attachment to his adjutant, a young man who shared the officer's labors during the day and his blankets at night. In the Navy, accounts of flogging for homosexual activity attest to the opportunities for sex on board ships. After the 1820s, the growth of the American prison system created further possibilities for situational homosexuality. Convicts testified that strong attachments often develop between older and younger prisoners who share their possessions, their meals, and their beds. Other prisoners, however, recall being forced to engage in sex against their will.
So it's was illegal to be a part of sodomy. It was illegal to initiate it was illegal to initiate sodomy before, but then it became illegal to consent to sodomy as well. So those are two different things.
Yes. I mean, even if the laws were like on the books, as this book notes, that like there just weren't a lot of indictments being handed out for this, right? And
Yeah.
honestly, what could have also happened is, police officer comes across a wealthy gentleman and a lower class gentleman, making out on the street or doing something in a back alley, and a couple bucks, bribe is enough to have them leave, right? It's just not
Yeah.
a priority. I imagine that as urbanization is increasing, opportunities for crime go up significantly, and so assuming that that was the focus of the police force, they probably just couldn't bother with this kind of behavior going on. But as we've discussed in the Straight State and other texts, there was this increased medical focus that began to look at the impact of same-sex relationships, and especially kind of convince the population that they were actually a danger to society. And I think when that kind of grew into the public consciousness, it became more of a priority to regulate both people pursuing homosexual activity as well as those who are willing to receive it.
Okay. Okay. That makes a little bit more sense, yeah.
The West provided extensive opportunities for male-male intimacy. Some men were drawn to the frontier because of their attractions to men. All men were thought to have strong innate lusts, and the absence of women may have channeled these desires to other men. Cowboy lore suggests that both long-term attachments and temporary sexual unions could form in the Wild West. Upon the death of his partner, for example, one cowboy wrote a poem declaring that the two had loved in the way men do, that is, an unspoken love truer than any woman's kiss could be. A limerick jokingly insinuated that older cowboys occasionally initiated younger men sexually. Younger cowboys had a great fear that old steers once filled with beer, completely addled, they'd throw on the saddle and ride them in the rear. At least one territorial court case reveals that the cowboys attempted to hire younger men to spend the night with them. In the frontier army, where soldiers often purchased the services of female prostitutes, some men clearly sought male partners as well. At Fort Meade in the Dakota Territory, a Mrs. Nash first married one soldier, and when her husband was transferred, she married another man. After her death, Mrs. Nash's identity as a man was discovered. So this is an interesting aspect of history, and it's one where like there's definitely an analog to trans history, and I don't want to like throw out the idea that people who cross-dressed were, not trans. But as the book goes into detail, there were lots of reasons to cross-dress during this era, and so it's difficult to say everyone who was cross-dressing was doing this because they, were trans. And I'm, again, more than willing to accept that like a decent chunk of these people were trans, or were processing feelings in a way we would now identify as being trans. It's just difficult, right, to kind of discern like which is which. Working class women also found that adopting the identity of the opposite gender could expand their sexual opportunities. Most women did not share men's ability to support themselves outside of their family. Thus, when working class women sought to establish same sex relationships, they often did so by adopting men's clothing and passing as men in order to earn wages and marry other women. In the 1850s, for example, Lucy Ann Lobdell left her husband in upstate New York and passed as a man in order to support herself. I made up my mind to dress in men's attire to seek labor, she explained, and to earn men's wages. Keep in mind that, this is still a problem in America. There's a vast disparity between the amount of money women at the time could earn in a day and men could earn, even if they were doing literally the same work. It was just like, oh, well, men have to support a family, so of course we're going to pay them more. Later, she became the Reverend Josh. Boy, words are not wording for me today. Later, she became the Reverend Joseph Lobdell and set up a house with Mariah Perry. Mariah Perry. Living for 10 years as man and wife. In the 1870s, a French immigrant, Jean Bonnet, was frequently arrested by San Francisco police for wearing men's clothing. Reporters called her a man-hater and described her as having short-cropped hair, an unwomanly voice, and a masculine face which harmonized excellently with her customary suit of boys' clothing. Bonnet visited brothels as a male customer and fell in love with prostitute Blanche Bunot, who she convinced to leave her trade. In 1876, an angry pimp murdered Bonnet when she murdered Bonnet. Oh boy. So, Jean Bonnet married Blanche Bunot. An angry pimp murdered Bonnet while she lay in Bonnet's bed. Across the country, New York City, a woman took the name Murray Hall and began to dress as a man. She opened an employment bureau, settled down with the first of her two wives, and later adopted a daughter. Hall became influential in the Tammany Hall Democratic political machine and earned a reputation for drinking, playing poker, and being sweet on women. Other stories of passing women appeared in newspapers throughout the country. The account of Bill, a Missouri laborer who became secretary of the International Brotherhood of Boilermakers, typified the successful passing woman who lived as men did and loved other women. She drank, she swore, she courted girls, she worked hard as her fellows, she fished, she camped, and she even chewed tobacco.
This is a very interesting history because it's kind of hard to differentiate the like different understandings that we have of queer culture today to what we're witnessing in these books and what's documented in these books. So it just it's a different understanding of history. Obviously, they didn't have the medical advancements that we have today for the transgender surgeries or the hormone blocking and things like that, but it's very interesting to hear the ways in which people went about their lives in order to feel the most authentically them.
Yeah, and again, like I don't want to discount that trans people existed, but what we're hearing described could also be described as lesbians, women loving women, right? You
Yeah.
have women who adopt masculine clothing, who cut their hair short. We have a term for that now, and that's butch. And so it's really difficult to look at this at a bygone era before people had the language to like accurately describe their feelings and emotions, and say, oh well, it was obviously an example of trans culture, it was obviously an example of lesbian culture, it was obviously an example of people just trying to get by. And this is, I think, one of the difficulties of writing accurate histories, because you have to take all that into account and then also like draw conclusions without being able to look inside people's brains, right? You have to look at their actions and draw conclusions about like who they were, when there are often times when people's actions are independent of their independent inner thoughts. And so yeah, it's just boy, I don't know if I could be a historian given all of these difficulties. It's really frustrating. And one thing I was thinking about as I was reading this section is in the modern era, there's still an ongoing debate, I think, in the queer community about like what it means to be gay or what it means to, not be straight. And, there's the people who are like, well, it's, who you have sex with. Well, as we talked about earlier, there's a lot of examples of people who identify as heterosexual who occasionally will have sex with the same sex. They may do porn, they may be locked up in prison, they may be in another place, they may, there's 1,000 reasons you can come up with for why you might do that. They may be part of a threesome, and they do it because they think their partner is going to enjoy it. And there's also, people who identify as gay who are 12 years old, they're 15 years old, they've never had sex, and so it's like, well, why would we base like that upon why would we use that as the basis for what people actually want? So then I think kind of where the community has settled is you kind of just take people at their word. And, if they say they're attracted to someone, if they say they fall into a specific category, you're like, okay, sure, I buy that. I can't look inside your brain. I'm going to presume if you say you're gay, you're probably going to be gay. The problem with that is it's again very difficult to document in objective form. It's difficult to follow someone around and be like, I'm gonna check your grinder usage and what dates you go on and all of that. You also have the problem that there can still be compulsory heterosexuality in our culture. So even if they actually are gay, they're fully gay, they're forced by their families into marriage arrangements that they don't feel comfortable in. So or they might marry out of convenience. They might be comfortable marrying someone who they aren't attracted to just so they can get like a large paycheck or something. And when you think about that, where it's like going off of what people actually identified as going back 150 years, I don't know if there was really this concept of like sexual identity. I don't know if this was something that people really thought about. Like there are obviously cultural expectations that skewed what people thought they wanted, but like I couldn't say for certain if you poked around in the head of one of these people how they would identify. I don't know if they would say I am a woman who likes women. I think they would have a million possible things they could say, and all of these instances are going to be different. So again, just a very frustrating field, and I'm always impressed when authors are able to like sift through the records and come across one narrative that kind of defines the era. But even then, I'm a little bit skeptical, where I'm like, I can see there being other explanations for some of this. It seems difficult or even inaccurate to broad brush it.
No, I again, I think it's a lot of I don't want to say inaccuracy, but it's like we aren't there. We can't understand what was going on. Even if it's, during when we were reading the straight state, it was, oh, well, somebody had, looked through another person's like holes in their log cabin or something and reported that this was going on and that there was, something heinous going on. But there isn't that level of accuracy that you have there's never going to be a level of accuracy that is always extremely, I don't want to say accurate, that's just too many versions of accurate, but again, it's just we aren't there, we don't know, therefore like we can only perceive what we're given by historians. And so this is a great way to understand the sort of themes that come along with this time period, but this isn't a great way to understand individual instances every single time.
So I am going to skip many pages. I'm going to skip a discussion of kind of lesbianism in this era. Again, if you're interested in this, book goes into detail, a lot of discussion of kind of middle class attitudes. I think we covered this a bit in The Straight State, and we covered this a bit in Sex in the Heartland. So, if you're interested in that sort of thing, we have gone into detail about this in the past. This is not, new evidence that we're skipping over. I would be remiss to not like touch upon the fact that like there were subcultures of sexual activity that developed in between African American individuals and white individuals. And I don't want to go into too much detail because it kind of boils down to slavery. Am I right? Unfortunately, a large percentage of relationships, between African American individuals and white individuals, and these were both sexes in all arrangements you can imagine, were exploitative. Someone was a slave, someone took advantage of that. Yeah, it's not great. I think it's important to note that this was, something that was going on, but simultaneously, I don't know if it meaningfully informs kind of our modern understanding of relationships, because these were not consensual the vast majority of the time, right? These were exploitative. They were power imbalances where people could face death if they didn't do what the other person wanted. They were horrendous and terrifying, and I feel bad wanting to skip over it, but simultaneously, I don't know if there's much I can add to the discourse that, like, slavery was abominable, and you should question anybody who looks at you with a straight face and says, we should bring back the Confederacy or the ideals thereof. Naomi, let's talk about contraception.
I like contraception.
Birth control offers perhaps the most dramatic example of the change that occurred in American sexual mores during the middle of the 20th century. At the start of the 1920s, it still bore the mark of radicalism, and the birth control movement appeared to many as a threat to moral order. The federal Comstock law, with its prohibition on the importation, mailing, and interstate shipment of contraceptive information and devices, remained in effect, and almost half of the states, including most of the populous ones in the Northeast and Midwest, had their own anti-contraceptive statutes. To agitate for birth control placed one outside of the law. By the late 1960s, however, virtually all legal impediments to access had collapsed, and the federal government was actively promoting it. Advances in technology and shifts in values made reliable contraceptives an integral feature of married life, as well as widely available to the unmarried. For most of the 1920s and 30s, Margaret Sanger remained the key figure in the birth control movement and the individual most responsible for the changes that occurred. Though her leadership and visibility provided continuity of the pre-World War I agitation, the politics of the movement was undergoing an important shift. Government repression of radicalism and the decline of organized feminism after suffrage altered the context in which the fight for birth control was occurring. Sanger adapted to the new circumstances by detaching the question of contraception from larger social issues and movements. Throughout the 20s and 30s, she campaigned solely to make contraception freely available to women. Even with a narrowed focus, however, Sanger remained a militant fighter, willing to use any means necessary to achieve her goals. She continued to risk arrest, believing that as she did, that agitation through violation of the law was key to the public. She also propagandized widely through her pages of her journal, The Birth Control Review, through the books that she authored, and through her extensive speaking tours and public conferences. With the backing of her organization, the American Birth Control League, Sanger lobbied for legislative change and embarked once again on a venture in clinical services when she established the Clinical Research Bureau in 1923. Sanger's lobbying efforts and the clinic that she supported point to an important way which her strategy was evolving. In New York State in the 1920s, she campaigned for a doctor's only bill, designed to allow physicians to provide contraceptives, but restricting that right to licensed practitioners. The Clinical Research Bureau, though it provided female clients with contraceptive devices, existed mainly to gather data that would persuade a science-conscious profession that safe, reliable methods of fertility control were available. Both initiatives aimed at re-enlisting the medical profession as allies in her cause, since its hostility to contraception constituted a major obstacle to success. In the process, however, the politics of birth control tilted in a more conservative direction. From a key issue in the struggle for female emancipation, contraception was gradually becoming a matter of professional health care. As it turned out, medical support was slow to materialize. Sanger found few doctors willing to risk their professional status by an association with anything that bore her imprint. For much of the 1920s and 30s, prominent physicians and medical organizations responded negatively to the campaign for birth control. In 1925, Morris Fishbein, the editor of a prestigious journal of the American Medical Association, argued that no method of contraception existed that was physiologically, psychologically, and biologically sound in both principle and practice. A decade later, an AMA committee charged with studying the legal status of contraception reported that it was unable to find evidence that existing laws, federal or state, have interfered with any medical advice, despite the fact that laws in a number of states were being employed against physicians. When the AMA finally reversed its position in 1937, the change came largely through intensive lobbying by Sanger and her supporters of virtually every member of the AMA's House of Delegates. Even then, more time would have to elapse before American doctors were adequately trained to meet the needs of their female patients. As late as 1936, the overwhelming majority of the nation's reputable medical schools provided either no or incidental training in the practice of contraception. Sanger and other female activists, rather than the elite of the medical profession, deserve credit for making effective contraception accessible to American women. Sanger's clinic in New York served as a model for others. Local birth control leagues, staffed and run largely by women reformers, established clinics of their own. By 1930, there were 55 of them in 23 cities. 8 years later, with the Depression having intensified the need for contraception, their numbers had grown to over 300. Although the clinics reached only a small proportion of American women, staff members magnified their long-term influence by the work they did with local doctors. Securing the name of physicians sympathetic to the desire of women to control their fertility, clinic personnel maintained an elaborate referral system that increased the availability of contraceptives at the same time that performed the important task of educating the nation's doctors. Soon, private hospitals as well as some state public health services were setting up birth control facilities. By 1942, there were more than 800 clinics scattered across the nation.
That's impressive. I think it's very interesting to hear that in the early, like, 1900s, that like the 1920s, 1930s, that it was like contraceptives were widely used and widely promoted. I didn't realize that that was a something that happened, because I just assumed that the only form of contraceptive was going to be the condom and things like that. But I didn't realize that that was even a possibility. I guess I didn't really look into it because contraceptives, the oral birth control, was legalized in the 1970s. So I don't know, I didn't really think about it before then. I just assumed that it wasn't really used other than condoms. So yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I shouldn't gloss over the fact that, like, Sanger had some views that haven't aged well. This book kind of characterizes them as, like, driven by pragmatism. I don't fully agree with that. I think she's more of just a product of her times, but I think it's worth, reading that as well. It notes that her dogged determination encouraged to employ any rationale that might add supporters to the cause. So, one example is she took advantage of a new emphasis on compassionate marriage during this period to attack methods such as coitus interruptus and urge instead the adoption of artificial contraceptives. Withdrawing, she wrote, has the evil effect upon the woman's nervous condition. She has not completed her desire. She is under a highly nervous tension. Her whole being is perhaps on the verge of satisfaction. She is left in this dissatisfied state, which is far from humane. She also argued that this fear of pregnancy had the unfortunate effect of making the embraces of her husband repugnant to many wives and led to children who were neither loved or cared for. Birth control, she thus argued, promised happier marriages and happier families. Now, that in mind, she also said a lot of stuff about immigrants, blacks, and the poor, because she was more than willing to play to nativist fears. She often defined the purpose of birth control as more children from the fit, less from the unfit. It was nothing more or less than the facilitation of the process of weeding out the unfit or preventing the birth of defectives. Her single-minded focus, though successful in making birth control a major public issue, had taken her a long distance from the radical milieu that had once nurtured her activism. So it's like, yeah, she's willing to, like, capitalize upon the issues of the day when, the public starts to say, oh, maybe marriage should be between happy people. She's like, oh, yeah, that supports my argument. Here's another thing that, supports it. But again, she had some not great views on, like, eugenics and minority populations breeding. And I don't think we should, run away from that. I think we need to accept that, there are activists who unfortunately are ahead of their time in some areas and exactly in line with their peers on other areas. And that's kind of the nature of history. Hopefully, as activists, as people who want to see the world change, we should always try to be better than generations before us. I heard one person say, I'm going to butcher the quote, something like, we should allow our children to create a world in which they see us as monsters. And not, oh, well, we need to actively encourage our children to revolt against us. More the idea should be, people should be given the resources to, look back and condemn prior generations for inaction. People should be able to push for radical change that makes society better to the extent that they just find it laughable that in the past certain things were tolerated. And if you think we're at the perfect point as a society right now, don't look outside and see, how we treat the poor or the homeless, right? There are certain things we do in our culture that are just kind of taken for granted, that are taken as a given. And, future generations will not look upon us affectionately for those decisions. Now, keep in mind, her organization also supplemented legislative efforts with litigation in the courts. By the early 1930s, it had 16 cases winning their way through the judicial system. A decision in 1930 permitted the shipping and advertising of birth control appliances intended for legal use. A booming business in the manufacture of contraceptive devices resulted, especially of condoms whose use could be justified for the prevention of disease. By mid-decade, the 15 largest manufacturers of condoms producing 1.5 million every single day. Drugstores, gas stations, restaurants, barbershops, and newsstands sold them, making condoms easily accessible to men of every class. a young Malcolm X supplemented his income shining shoes at a Boston dance hall by selling rubbers. In 1936, in a landmark decision, a federal appeals court overturned the anti contraception provisions of the Comstock Law. Writing the decision in United States versus One Package, that's a great name for a company, Judge Augustus Hand pointed to the weight of authority in the medical world unavailable when the law was passed in 1873, establishing the safety and reliability of modern contraceptive practice. The decision allowed doctors to prescribe contraceptives for whatever reasons they deemed appropriate. The painstaking efforts of Sanger's Clinical Research Bureau had finally borne some fruit. Major shifts in contraceptive usage provide impressive evidence of the birth control movement's effectiveness. Interview data from the Kinsey study of female sexual behavior document the change. A comparison of white, married, college educated women born in the late 18th century with those born in the second decade of the 20th reveals important differences in practice. Among the older group of women, 2/5 reported much use by their husbands of condoms, 1/5 of the women douched, and 1/5 often resorted to male withdrawal to limit fertility. 31% of these women used diaphragms. By contrast, among the younger cohort, douching withdrawal had declined to almost the point of vanishing, and the condom was slightly less commonly employed by husbands, but reliance on the diaphragm had doubled, with 61% of the respondents using it frequently. Over the course of 2 decades, the device most espoused by birth control advocates and the most dependable female-controlled method had surpassed by far all the other methods of fertility control among the middle class.
I just didn't realize how popular condoms were. I guess I never really thought about it. But you said 1.5 million per day were being produced. That's
I
crazy.
I almost wonder like if a big purchaser of this was like the federal government. Like I understand it's 1930, but like there was still I guess a standing army and like the federal government had like lots of experience during World War 1 and probably could predict similar stuff in World War 2 of like oh, we're going to send soldiers over there. They're probably going to, interact with sex workers. Venereal disease is going to take a lot of them down. What if we like made strides in order to prevent that? It's sort of like at the Olympics, how they always have like 50 million condoms available or whatever. It's like, look, we know people are going to have sex. That's just kind of the reality of putting a bunch of attractive people together in like the same space. The least we can do is like promote safe sex behavior during this period. I should note here that there has been pushback by athletes about why all the condoms disappear. Some people are like, oh, well, athletes are just having sex. That's all they do nonstop in the Olympic Village. And the athletes are like, no, it's a souvenir, right? We just take big handfuls of condoms, right? That's like the coolest thing to have. It's like a souvenir. It's not like they can steal the beds. It's not like they can take those awesome chocolate muffins with them home and put them in a display case. No, it's a cool condom that has like the Olympic logo on it, right? It's cheap. It's something they can give their friends. Yeah, so contraception, big impact on the United States. I mean, we've sort of discussed this in other books such as Sex in the Heartland, Front Porch to the Back Seat, and then a little bit, I guess, in the Straight State. But one of the reasons that like contraception became so popular during this era was partially a desire for familial control, this concern about overpopulation that was happening during this period, but also racism because a lot of groups wanted to prevent the rise of minorities from taking over America from them and across the world as well. And so a lot of state and local governments suddenly were okay with contraception when it became clear that a larger and larger percentage of their population was composed of minority individuals. So this is unfortunately, probably contraception advocates doing what Margaret Sanger did and kind of capitalizing on racist fears, nativist fears in order to further their agenda. It's it's frustrating to kind of come down on like whether or not this tactic was bad. Like I'm obviously not saying it was good, but it's also like I don't know how you would undistance yourself from that discourse. I don't know how you would make the argument that contraception is good and allows people to family plan without already aligning yourself with the people who are more than happy to lean into people's xenophobia. It's a difficult era. I mean, very happy obviously that contraception emerged, but the circumstances under which it occurred and like the ways it was implemented obviously leave room for improvement. um the last thing that I think I want to talk about is the Kinsey survey. Naomi, do you know anything about the Kinsey survey?
Yes. So I am a public health. I am getting my master's in public health. I guess you could say I'm a public health major. But that it is still referenced to this day. So it had a good ripple effect. Um, yeah, Joel, take it away.
So we've discussed this numerous times on this podcast. This is not like new information, but this book goes over it and provides some like related information that I think provides additional context for why it was like so subversive, why it changed like people's understanding of sexuality overnight. Obviously there was the data that was revealed, but there's like some circumstantial stuff that's pretty interesting. So, Alfred Kinsey's studies of male and female sexual behavior were published in 1948 and 1953, respectively, and they propelled sex into the public eye in a way unlike any previous book or event had done. Whether bought, read, debated, or attacked, the Kinsey Report stimulated a nationwide examination of America's sexual habits and values. Kinsey was an unlikely candidate to instigate such a furor. A professor of zoology at Indiana University, he had built his professional reputation with a meticulous study of the North American gall wasp. An interest in human sexuality grew out of his experiences of team teaching a course on marriage and the family for undergraduates in the late 1930s. Students were hungry for accurate, unbiased information about sex, and as a scientist, Kinsey was appalled by the absence of reliable, non moralistic data concerning human sexual behavior. Although some surveys of sexual behavior had appeared in the 1920s and 30s, thus smoothing the way for his own work, they lacked the scientific rigor that he sought. In response, he began to collect his own data by recording the sexual case histories of undergraduates and others. Before long, he had assembled a small research team and trained them in interviewing methods and note taking techniques that allowed them to cover a subject's sex life in a number of hours. Over the next decade, Kinsey and his associates obtained case histories of 18,000 men and women. Kinsey was undoubtedly as surprised as anyone that his study of the male, the first one published, attracted so much notoriety. The 804-page tome had all the trappings of a scientific treatise. Written in a dry, almost boring style, the volume contained hundreds of elaborate charts and graphs, methodological discussions of the interviewing process and the validity of the data, and a comprehensive review of the literature. On the basis of a marketing survey of the book's potential readership, its staid medical publisher issued a first run of only 5,000 copies. But even before its official release date in January 1958, demand for sexual behavior in the human male had far surpassed the original expectations. Almost 250,000 copies were eventually sold. A little bit more than the 5,000 they budgeted for. And the book spent 27 weeks on the New York Times bestseller list. 5 years later, when the companion volume on the female was issued, it too became a publishing sensation. Now, I mean, this book goes into detail about like what was discussed. It notes that the findings proved shocking to traditional moralists. The study of the male, for instance, revealed that masturbation and heterosexual petting were nearly universal, that almost 90% of men had engaged in premarital intercourse, half in extramarital sex, and over a third of adult males had homosexual experience. Yada, yada, yada. We've gone over this before, right? It's all really interesting. They continue to do updates every couple of years. So, if this is the sort of thing that interests you, I would, urge you to check it out. Now, the aura of science that surrounded the studies made it safe for the press to give them ample publicity. A month before the male study was available in bookstores, Look magazine gave an indication of the way many would approach the book. What they have learned and will learn, editorialized, may have tremendous effect on the future social history of mankind, for they are presenting facts. They're revealing not what should be, but what is. For the first time, data on human sexual behavior is entirely separated from questions of philosophy, moral values, and social customs. So that's like a really interesting thing I hadn't considered, which is because this was a scientific paper, because it had been so thoroughly researched, news media was able to engage with it in a way that like sensationalized, obscene material of the era wasn't something they could discuss. Right? This was like medical research from, a university. It was something that was, objective and clear. And so, rather than them having to be like, oh, we're not going to touch, this salacious material. We don't want to drag ourselves down the mud. They're like, oh, man, we could discuss the salacious material, but pretend we're educating people. And genuinely, I think many editors probably, wanted to cover this topic in some form, and this just kind of gave them an excuse for it. But simultaneously, I think there were also publishers that wanted to have more provocative conversations in their papers, but couldn't justify it until now, and this gave them like the perfect outlet. The reports became cultural landmarks and Kinsey a household word. Professionals in the wide range of fields organized over 200 major symposiums on the male study, more than 50 books were published that capitalized on the attention the studies were attracting, and newspapers made headlines out of the release of critiques of his work. Popular writers and columnists quickly incorporated his findings into discussions of America's sexual habits. The zoologist Kinsey appeared on the cover of Time magazine, while Hollywood producers scrambled to obtain movie rights to the volumes. I don't know what that would look like at all. All in all, newspaper editors discovered that articles about sex in the daily press did not elicit a horrified response from the mass of readers. Instead, opinion polls suggested that a large majority of the public approved of scientific research on sexuality and were eager to learn more. Undoubtedly, the revelation of a wide divergence between ideals and actual behavior alleviated the anxiety of Americans about whether their own private habits set them apart from others. And the scientific credentials of the author gave legitimacy to the curiosity many Americans had about sexual subjects, as well as to their own presentation in media. So again, I think it's important to kind of understand the mindset a lot of people are approaching this from. A lot of people are still raised in households that probably didn't have open, frank conversations about sex and sexuality. A lot of people, men especially's understanding about sex and sexuality was like lurid conversations with friends or strangers on the street, or trashy paperback novels, or rudimentary pornography that they would pick up, right? It's all kind of hush hush, and so it's difficult to assess whether or not, quote unquote, you're normal. It's difficult to assess whether or not certain desires you have are okay. And we've discussed before how, like, one of the weird aspects about World War II that kind of kicked off a lot of queer culture in the United States was all these people coming from across the country and converging to a place where they were free from the judgment of their peers and could openly act in ways that would have been deemed unacceptable by the communities. And in the same way, I think the Kinsey report helped start those conversations where suddenly people are like, I've never really considered whether or not there are other people who are gay. Suddenly there's this scientific journal that's analyzing all this information and making it appropriate to talk about. But also, it's something you can talk about with your peers and you can sound smart, right? It's not like, did you see that thing on Pornhub last night? It's, I purchased an elaborate 804 treatise and a 4-page treatise on sexuality. I am educated. Let's talk about some of the juicier stuff.
Never in my entire life have I heard someone say, "Hey, did you see that thing on Pornhub last night?"
It's going to be very funny in a couple of years when like Pornhub becomes like the biggest source of news across the country. Legacy media is like closing up shop all over, and I can imagine like a group of like journalists get together and in like the comments on like porn videos will like insert like breaking news, this thing's going on, and like that's the way people receive updates, because Twitter's not going to last much longer at this rate. It's not like that's going to be the source of people's news. Blue Sky doesn't have the reach, so why not capitalize on the existing network that the majority of the world is connected to? Food for thought. People can steal my
Oh,
idea.
so true. So true.
So the other thing that the Kinsey report did, besides making it more commonly discussed in public, was it also pushed back against all of the obscenity laws that were in the United States at the time. This Kinsey studies, as much as pornography, shaped the context in which the Supreme Court responded to the obscenity issue. Between 1957 and 1967, the justices heard a series of obscenity cases. Though rarely achieving unanimity, what's the word?
Is it anonymity or is it unanimity?
Though they were never unanimous, the
unanimity.
Warren Court progressively
Yes.
contracted the domain of obscenity, in large part by affirming the appropriateness of sex as a matter for public consumption. In 1957, in the Roth decision, the court sustained the conviction of a book dealer accused of selling pornography, while also observing that sex and obscenity are not synonymous. Only material which deals with sex in a manner appealing to prurient interest could be prosecuted under the obscenity statutes. The same year, the justices declared a Michigan obscenity law unconstitutional because its stringent provisions would reduce the adult population in Michigan to reading only what is fit for children. This is to burn the house to roast the pig. That's a good analogy. As other litigation involving films, photo magazines, pornographic classics, male homosexual erotica, and pulp novels reached the court, new criteria were added to the prurience test. Finally, in 1966, in the celebrated Fannie Hill case, Justice Brennan wove together the various strands of the court's thinking. A book cannot be prescribed unless it is found to be utterly without redeeming social value. This is so even though the book is found to possess the requisite prurient appeal and be patently offensive. Each of the three federal constitutional criteria is to be applied independently. The social value of the book can neither be weighed against nor canceled by its prurient appeal or patent offensiveness. For the next several years, the court cleared every book that passed before it, suggesting that nothing warranted the label obscene. Although the court neither caused the spread of sexually explicit material nor created the demand for it, its rulings did sweep away the remnants of comstockery, that is, kind of moral behavior in U.S. culture. The impact was almost immediate. At one extreme, pornographic books, magazines, and films proliferated, with their sexual content growing progressively stronger, as the President's Commission on Obscenity and Pornography noted in 1970. Of greater import, perhaps, was the effect of these decisions on mainstream media. Popular novels, mass circulation magazines, metropolitan newspapers, Hollywood films, and even television, the family's entertainer, rushed to take advantage of the new liberal climate sanctioned by the courts. Hollywood adopted a much looser production code in the late 1960s. Sexually explicit novels such as City of the Night and Naked Lunch became bestsellers. This slow movement, evident since World War I, towards the inclusion of the erotic in the public sphere, suddenly rushed ahead, as sex became the daily staple of American popular culture. Rather than effecting a revolution in sexual standards, the Supreme Court had placed its imprimatur on tendencies inherent to the logic of sexual liberalism. Sex was now on display for all to see.
That's interesting that that was such a defining, the Kinsey report was such a defining moment for sex in the United States.
Yeah, I guess I always understood the Kinsey report as like changing social views of sex. And I didn't realize what an impact it could also have on the legal
Yeah.
aspect of sex. And that in turn has a huge effect on the media of sex. And so, like, obviously, the Kinsey report had a huge impact. I knew that. We've discussed that. But, like, I just didn't understand how huge that huge impact was.
I'm just like thinking back to the straight state discussion where we talked about the congressman that would just walk around with like pictures of like porn in a binder in on the congress room floor.
No, no, no. That was that. I think that was how sex changed the internet and how the internet changed sex.
Anyways, thinking about that and thinking about how the Kinsey report would have, if that wasn't published, that would have never happened. So,
Yeah.
coat closet meetings about porn on the internet would have never happened.
Oh, Congress. Never change. Naomi, what have we learned in this book? What do you feel are the big takeaways?
Well, I'm not going to go chronologically. I'm just going to bring up things as they come to my mind. The Kinsey report changed a lot of things, changed the society's views on sex in a broad spectrum way. Um, we don't know a lot about transgender history. We don't know a lot about like cross dressing, how like lesbians and gays fit into that. Um, and I would like to put out there that this book, though it does give a little bit more detail, doesn't give a full accurate representation, which is fine. There's not a lot out there. What else did we talk about?
Revolutionary stuff, pre American independence stuff, Civil War stuff.
Yeah, the wide use of condoms and contraceptives. I'm starting to mix up books, Joel.
Damn.
We've talked a lot about sex in the United States the past like three
I,
books.
I think the big thing for me was the discussion in parts 1 and 2 about how quote unquote deviant behavior in revolutionary and pre American independence times was not a death sentence. It was not the end of your life. You were considered bad, but your behavior could be fixed with, a fine or like a heavy labor or something. It was, very rare that like being gay was, the thing that would have cast you out from the community. And I think part of that stems from kind of the understanding of like what being gay was, where it was like, oh, it's just a sin you committed, not like it's a lifestyle. And that's probably for the better, because if people had thought it was a lifestyle, that probably would have resulted in more death sentences. But yeah, no, it's just fascinating to me that we consider the past to be so intolerant of queer individuals, and for the most part I think they were. Obviously these behaviors were strongly discouraged, but it's not as though that was the end of your like social life. There was that one guy who like, I don't know, was convicted of sodomy, but then like became sheriff of the town or whatever a couple of years later. And it's like, wow, this person can still become a respectable member of the community, even in a community that strongly disfavors like what he does. So yeah, I think it's helpful having books like this that can kind of piece together how society understood stuff over time. I'm not always going to understand it because some of this is just deeply confusing and doesn't make a lot of sense to me in like a modern context. But it's really helpful at kind of understanding how our understanding. I'm using understanding a lot. It's helpful to understand how people's conceptions of relationships and sexuality have changed over time, because in turn it allows us to sort of look at how we view them in the present and draw lessons from that.
We've talked a lot about sexual history, relationship history in the past like three books that we've read. And I think it gives like a much fuller picture if you listen to all three book reports than just one or the other.
Yeah, and I should note that I think this book was published in 1988. Straight State was published sometime in the early 2000s, I believe. And then How Sex Changed the Internet was published in like the 2020s. And so I think that's fascinating because they encompass like different periods of history while also overlapping at times. And they're also written, I think, radically different cultures. You have the 1980s where like being gay is still illegal in I think the entire United States. There's still sodomy statutes on, the books of a lot of states. You have the early 2000s where like being gay was okay, and that I think the Supreme Court already overturned the sodomy ban, but simultaneously there's still a huge amount of cultural stigma around like queer culture. And then you have one written in the 2020s, which is, look at like internet culture and all the different ways that encouraged queer communities. But, simultaneously, it's not as though, being gay is something that's accepted in all parts of the world or even all parts of the United States. There's still pushback, though obviously much lesser than it was in the past. So it's, encouraging seeing how that evolves over time, and, fascinating too, just seeing the different approaches. Anything else, Naomi? Can I go die now? Listeners, I'm going to edit this so well. Listeners won't be able to tell that I've been like coughing and wheezing, that this was like an hour and a half of like having to edit around Joel just sneezing, coughing, and catching his breath in weird places.
I think you can go die now.
There's nothing more to say, Naomi. I'm going to go die. I'm glad those are the last words my sister said to me. Thank you for listening, listeners. We will chat with you next week.